So welcome back, everybody. We have Doley Tshering with us right now. Brittany Maguire will be joining us in a little bit later. Doley here, as I was saying, is going to address some global climate change and agriculture issues, and then Brittany will focus us in on Atlantic Canada for her portion. So that all that being said, I believe the floor is yours here, Doley. If you want to introduce yourself, please go ahead or begin your presentation, whatever you think is best.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you, Mark, and my friend TP for this opportunity. For those who don't know, TP and I come from the same country, this very small country in the Himalayas called Bhutan. I don't know how many of you know Bhutan. Thanks for the opportunity. As Mark mentioned, I will speak to you a little bit about climate change and agriculture work, which my organization, the organization that I work for, is doing in various parts of the world. I would not go into a lot of details on what the global agricultural impacts are. So it would be you'd be happy to know it'd be very straightforward talk. No, nothing technical. With that, Mark, can I go ahead and share my screen? Mark, I think you're muted.
You're muted, yeah.
Yeah, you'd think I'd be used to Zoom by now. Boy. Yeah, you should be able to share your screen.
Okay, so let me do that. Okay. Hopefully you are all able to see my screen now.
Yes.
Okay, so once again, thank you guys. Thank you for this opportunity. Tshering and I, we are like childhood friends. So this is a great opportunity to be able to connect with Tshering's folks in New Brunswick. So I work with the UNDP. I manage a program called the Jeff Small Grants Program. I don't know how many of you know UNDP, but I'm pretty sure many of you probably never heard of the Small Grants Program, the SGP. So I hope to give you some introduction to SGP today. So today I will focus, on three sort of broad topics. First, I will introduce to you SGP, or the Global Environment Facility, or SGP as we are known. Then I'll spend a little time discussing, again, as I mentioned earlier, not too technical, but a little bit, in terms of how agriculture is important in the issue of climate change, both in terms of contributing to, but also more importantly, how do we need to adapt to climate change impacts in agriculture. Then I will give you a flavor of the work that we do in SGP. So I'll present three case studies from our work in agriculture adaptation to climate change. We work in a lot more areas. We work in addressing biodiversity conservation. We work in also improving sound management of chemicals into international waters and oceans, etc. But today I will focus on the climate change and agriculture. So SGP. So indeed, what is SGP? We are a global program. We are currently active in 125 countries. We work on 4-year cycles. We are in the 7th cycle. By the end of this cycle, which would be around 2022, we hope to increase our presence in at least another 4 or 5 countries. So by end of 2022, we might actually be in around 130 countries globally. We are funded by the Global Environment Facility, GF. The GF is a trust fund, a multi-donor trust fund. Canada is a very important donor to that trust fund. It's managed out of Washington, D.C., and supports programs, projects that address environmental projects globally in developing countries. Now, SGP, established in 1992, is born out of this premise that SGP has, that to work on global environmental issues, we need to take action at the local level. So global thinking with local action is our motto. And the way we do that is, we need to work with local communities to generate local livelihoods, local benefits, while at the same time, we work in community empowerment and capacity building so that project successes, best practices, the results that come out of these projects remain way beyond the duration of the project. So if you like, in many, to use a jargon for the sustainability of these initiatives. We have so far supported around 22,000 or so projects globally. Project grants are usually around, they are small projects. SGP does not support governments directly. They support local community organizations called CBOs, or civil society organizations. So the grants are fairly small, up to about $50,000 US, but more than $600 million have been disbursed as project grants so far. We work in at least 37 SIDS, or small island developing states, and around 40 or so LDCs, or least developed countries. Now, in the context of climate change, that is important because these countries are highly vulnerable to climate change, through a combination of factors of, their lower capacity to adapt, and also, reliance on really highly sensitive sectors such as agriculture, forestry, etc. This is just for information. In terms of SGP, the grants we provide, our regular grants, of course, are up to $50,000 in the countries. For some organizations, especially really community-based, remote community-based organizations, for whom maybe accessing donor funds, accessing development aid maybe for the first time, we also provide what is called a planning grant. So we support communities with up to $5,000 so they can hire someone to help them write up these proposals. And very, in a very rare cases, like I mentioned earlier, where we are scaling up some of these successes, some sustainable practices that have been generated from the projects, we also support through a little higher amount through what is called strategic grants. Since about 2-3 years ago, we've also introduced something called the innovation program. And with this, what we're trying to do is across the regions, we kind of identify some emerging issues. For instance, we have worked on the mercury issue in the artisanal gold mining. We've worked on in the conservation in big cats conservation. In agriculture, we've also worked on eco-agriculture. So we identify certain emerging themes and issues, and have a global call through these called the innovation program. On the right side of the slide, you would see these steps in the application process, not so relevant, but just as a way of, describing that to you, that these SGP grants at the country level are very decentralized. The grant making decisions are taken by a voluntary committee called National Steering Committee. And usually these steering committees are majority CSO representation, although government also sits on the panel, but it's majority CSOs. There's a transparent call for proposals, and any community group, including, as I'll present to you, groups of young people, youth groups, people like many of the participants here, who come together to address an environmental issue or an agricultural problem can access these funds in the developing countries that we work with. Now, unfortunately, we do not work in developed countries because they are the donors, and we are in many ways a channel to fund donor aid to developing countries. So next up is the impact of climate change on agriculture. Now, I'm sure all of you appreciate the importance of climate change. The issue is dominating. It's arguably one of the most challenging issue of our lifetimes, and posing serious threats to the well-being and happiness. I would like to throw in happiness there. We come from the GNH country. Tshering, I'm sure, would have talked to you already about GNH. Impacts a lot in terms of the well-being and happiness of the people and the planet. Climate change has this power to do so. In terms of impacts, I mean, you would have heard globally that polar ice shields are melting, that the sea level in various parts of the world are rising, oceans are warming, and then in particularly in my part of the world, back in Asia, there's these glaciers that are melting, and there's this phenomenon called glacial lake outburst floods that's creating havoc and a threat to not only livelihoods but lives of communities that live downstream. So this is really climate change is really the defining issue of our time, and more so for less developed countries, developing countries like Bhutan, or in Asia and in Africa, because these countries, as I mentioned earlier, have less capacity to adapt, cope with, plus they're more prone to disasters, and they're highly reliant on sectors that are sensitive to climate change. Coming to the specific area impacts of climate change on agriculture. Now, this maybe just to throw in this fact that global climate change related efforts are led through what is called the United Nations Framework for Climate Change, which is UNFCCC. And a good thing that has happened in 2015 in December is that the governments of the world have come together to adopt something called the Paris Agreement. And I'm sure you are all familiar with this, but with the goal to keep the global warming to below 1.5 degrees, or hopefully below 2 degrees for sure. Following that, this has triggered a number of actions at the country level, and then globally a lot of research. And the landmark IPCC report, the panel that prepares scientific reports for the convention, said that we are increasingly achieving crossing the carbon budget for us, but there is a window to act, and we could keep it below 2 degrees warming, beyond which it would be catastrophic, and there would be basically havoc created all around the world. But the window to act is closing very fast. So therefore, many countries are coming together, developing their climate change actions. And climate change actions, as you probably know, consists of two. On the one hand, actions that reduce emissions in the first place, be it from energy or your lifestyle or agriculture, etc., which is called mitigation. And on the other hand, in terms of adapting to, because we all know that the climate change impacts are here to stay. No matter what we do, the greenhouse gas that are already in the atmosphere is causing warming and is impacting us. So adapting to that. So in agriculture, it's important because agriculture, as we all know, is contributing up to 10 to 12% of the total greenhouse gas emissions. Now, we always, in talking about climate change, we always talk, in the media, we'll always hear about air travel, oil and gas, coal, etc. But then, the big elephant in the room is that agriculture is also a major contributor. So there are ways, that communities and farming communities actually, for several thousands of years, millennia have come known this, that we need to work on improved crop and grazing, land management. We need to make sure that the land is not tilled so much. It's called minimum tillage. Basically, what this means is so we do not disturb the soil so much that the carbon escapes. And then other important aspects are also in terms, the improved and sound water management, agroforestry, or growing of trees together with agriculture. All of these, do their part in terms of keeping soil below the ground, carbon below the ground, or in terms of sequestering carbon from the atmosphere in the plants. And the other aspect in terms of the adaptation is agriculture is highly vulnerable to climate change. Now, climate change impacts that include from extreme weather events, which are more and more frequent now, that could include heat waves, include drought, maybe fires, incidents of pests and diseases, shortages of water, and especially in coastal areas, salination, where with the high level, with the rise in sea level, salt water, intrusion, that's impacting global agriculture. I mean, there are a number of adaptation options, particularly in agriculture. The mitigation and adaptation options are, quite often linked, and this can range from, improved technologies to improved varieties that are heat tolerant, drought tolerant, etc., to improve agronomic practices, and awareness, such as through what that's being done excellently by Mark and Tshering and the Hayes Farm in terms of how local people, young people, can act and contribute to these efforts. Now, coming to the small grants program, again,
Doley, can I ask you?
Sure.
On your last slide there, you were talking about adaptation strategies. I was wondering where the UN fits in with points of view for GMO crops, because I know that Monsanto, for example, has been waving the flag about GMO crops being a solution for climate change and for agriculture. And I'm just wondering where that fits into adaptation options.
Thanks, Mark. I think that's a really important question. I think on the one hand, there are two schools of thought. Unfortunately, there's no definite answer to it. On the one hand, I think there are proponents of GMO who kind of, quite rightfully argue that with the higher yields, that is possible from, a small net area. So higher yield per smaller net area would, help in feeding the world. So therefore, less impact, because one of the major impacts of agriculture is, as you know, is conversion of, natural forests, and especially in Amazon and, in Asia and in Africa, into agricultural areas. So if you can improve the yield significantly, we did quite a lot of that through the green revolution, but there's only so much that you can improve with, better practices and some better varieties. Now, GMOs, I know there's a lot of bad things that can go wrong and can happen with GMO, but what the potential they have in terms of higher food production. So on the one hand, there's a school of thought that supports it. On the other hand, because of the risks that are involved with GMO, there's also a group that's sort of totally against it. And then, of course, you throw in the mix the concerns around GMO escaping into the wild and the impact on biodiversity, etc. So I think it's a mixed bag. I don't know if that's a good answer, Mark.
It's certainly an honest answer. It certainly is a mixed bag, that's for sure.
Right. Thanks. So so moving on to how SGP works in agriculture. Now, I I mentioned to you, Mark. I'm not a agriculturist myself. I'm a forester by training. But what motivates me in the work that we do in agriculture in SGP is the fact that we do not work with big farms. And I mean, we are a small grant making bodies, working in several developing countries. We work with smallholder agriculture. Now, when we talk about agriculture activities, I think particularly in developed industrialist nations, you would think of big, 1,000-hectare farms. But that's not the case in the majority of the world. In the majority of the world, farms are managed by, one family households, actually something similar to, what you see in the picture here, sort of dispersed houses on the slope, in the landscape. And globally, around 85% of all farms are actually less than 2 hectares in size. Those are very small, very subsistence sort of oriented. More than 500 or 600 million of these farms globally. So that's where we support, that's where we focus on, because that's, kind of what we want to do in terms of building the capacity of these small farmers and improving their agricultural production. Go ahead, Mark.
I got one more here. I like this slide a whole lot, and I just wanted to point out that it's small scale farmers that are feeding more humans than compared to the large giant agro farms that are feeding the corporations that are then trying to feed into the economy, that are then trying to make money in order to feed people. It's the small scale farms that are legitimately feeding more people around the world, and small scale farmers are the ones that are doing it. Even on the scale that we operate here at Hayes Farm, that is more common around the world than the giant farms that we see out in the prairies. I just wanted to underline that.
Thank you, Mark. And I couldn't agree with you more. Except in the news, and of course when it comes to the policies of many governments, unfortunately, the big ones get all the attention, and they take the lion's share of whatever support there is available, and it's such a pity. But I couldn't agree with you more that it's the small farms, your mama papa farm in developing countries, and this wonderful work you guys are doing, that's actually feeding the world. So based on this, actually in our 7th cycle, I mentioned we work on like the 4-year cycles, and we are currently in the 7th cycle, which ends in 2022. In agriculture particularly, we have 4 objectives. One is working with these small farmers. We look at how can we move communities by improving their yield, by improving their efficiency, by adding value to value chain, marketing, etc. How can we move them slightly above in this the production chain, so that we cannot make them commercial farms, and that's not the intention, but that they're slightly beyond subsistence, that they are more resilient. The second objective is also that, and this has been tried and tested by communities through so many years of trial and error, that rather than growing just one crop, monocrop, or rather than focusing on one thing, that diversification is, especially in this highly risky world, in the world of climate change, diversification is what is helps you. And so we work with farms in terms of diversifying not only their the crops and the livestock that they keep, but also beyond the farm in terms of, what other alternative livelihoods that we can support. The third objective is, again, and this is coming more from being environmental focused fund. We support projects that deliver multiple benefits. So, for example, we would work with farms that create benefits through agroforestry, so that there's a removal of deforestation from the supply chains, but also we generate green energy at the farm level, etc. And the fourth objective is particularly working with the highly vulnerable communities in the mountains, in Andes, in the Himalayas, etc., where we are working with groups like Slow Food International. And we are working on developing agricultural products that can be certified, that can be marketed internationally, that would fetch the premium price, and that will help sustainable sort of practices back home, back in their communities. So that's how we work in terms of SGP. Any questions so far, or should I move on and complete? Now I have 3 examples that, from different parts of the world.
I got some questions.
Yeah, sure, Jared.
Hi, my name's Jared, and thank you very much for speaking today. This is awesome. I was wondering where, because the idea that the benefits only come from developed countries, and the colonial history and climate change, if you look at places like Alaska right now, climate change is having a severe effect on indigenous communities.
Right.
And you're looking at adaptability. Do you think indigenous practices and the restoration of them have a place within that framework of adaptation and biodiversity?
Jared, thank you very much. That's a wonderful question. And definitely, I think a highly untapped resource and is the indigenous practices, indigenous knowledge. I mean, you pick any area, biodiversity conservation, agriculture, there are, like I mentioned earlier, through centuries of, trial and error, indigenous communities have developed practices that are, not only sustainable, but sustainable and have minimum impacts, but are also, really scientifically very sound. It's just that they probably are not coded in such a way to be known as science in the modern, sense of the word, but they are science nonetheless, both in terms of function and, in terms of the role they play. So yes, I think there is a lot of potential. It's, I think, in my view, it's highly, untapped. There's a lot of potential to harness that. Good. So let me, yeah, sure, Mark.
Along the same lines, on what the world graph chart that you showed, a lot of funds are coming from developed countries going into less than developed countries. I was wondering about Canada's far north myself. That's where my thoughts were going to with Jared here. And the indigenous communities in Canada's north are dealing with rapid climate change more than we are here. And it appears to me that the Canadian government isn't exactly funding them well to deal with these kind of things. And even though they live in a developed country, would this program be accessible to them in their situations?
Thanks, Mark. So, the direct answer is, not this particular program as it's designed right now, because the funds come with certain conditions, if you like, from the trust fund. But we are also working with, in many ways, we look at the work we do with the GF, the Global Environment Facility Funds, to draw an analogy, that as a way of developing the rail tracks, if you like. Once you have the tracks developed, any sort of rail, any sort of train can go through it. It doesn't have to be necessarily funded by the GF. So the particular train that we have, which is funded by GF, that's meant for developing countries. But we are also working with foundations, private foundations, like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We are working with Microsoft to see how can we support vulnerable communities, no matter where they are. And so those are still, kind of work in progress right now. We, especially in the era of climate change, we realize that even if you look at developing countries, if you go to Bangkok, for instance, you would see, you would not, at one glance be kind of able to distinguish Bangkok from New York, because I mean it would look all developed, but then just step outside Bangkok and you have just abject poverty, and that kind of, and I think we need to be aware that like all elements are not equal. All regions, all areas in even in developed countries are not equal. So there are these. I know it's a long-winded response, but we are aware, and at least in our program, we are looking at partnering with like-minded foundations and others to sort of develop those. Okay, so let me show you the three sort of examples from SGP, and of course I'm from Bhutan, and I can't make a presentation without having one example from Bhutan. This is basically very much like Mark, the initiative that you are leading through the Hayes Farm, a rural group. It's a rural youth-based group that has come around. Bhutan is a very small country. Our population is even smaller. In the context of relatively in the world, we are less than 1 million. I think last census we were around 645,000 or something like that. Yet I think the biggest challenge, social challenge, is that there are a lot of young people who've been gone through this education, and then there's this promise of getting jobs, but either are not getting the jobs that they want, or they're coming out into graduating and coming out into the world and realizing, well, that's not what they want to do. So many groups are going back to farms and villages and finding out that that there's huge potential back in the villages, back in their farm, on their farms, and also finding out that because many of the youth had moved out and so-called the rural-urban migration, that back home a lot of lands are remaining uncultivated, fallow, degraded. So this is a story of a group that's called the Kenrik Namsum Cooperative, formed by about 10 youth, and they approached the small grants program, and they said, look, we want to take over these lands, we want to rehabilitate them and grow fruits, and and they want to go organic. So with the help of SGP, they first converted the farm into a big, by Bhutan standards, a big agroforestry plot. They rehabilitated the area, and then they grew fruits and vegetables. Now these fruits and vegetables are sold all markets of the country, including in the capital city in Thimphu. And the group last year made a profit of around $20,000. Now, of course, in Canada and in US, $20,000 would not go very far. But in a country where the minimum wage, particularly in remote areas, like $3 to $5 a day, that's a lot of money. And that's all, so it's not only creating these sustainable environmental benefits and this movement, but it's also creating these green jobs for the youth. So my next, you know, sort of really going across the world from Bhutan to Cuba is an example from a cooperative, and I won't even attempt to pronounce it because my Latin and Spanish is very bad. But it's CANP, and I think that's we'll stick to the acronym. Located about in a village located 50 kilometers south of Habana. This is a small agricultural cooperative, and they begin to realize that their livelihood is being challenged. Their livelihood is being impacted by climate change impacts, particularly pest and disease, and drought. So again, through the proposal submission process in Cuba, they approached the SGP, and we are supporting them. Do a number of things. We've collaborated with universities to develop heat-resistant varieties, and train farmers in using them, growing them. But more importantly, through a very participatory approach, we came up, the project, by we, I mean, the project came up with ways to improve the way they farm, better agronomic practices, and also, a lot of bio approaches in terms of bio fertilizer, bio, pesticides, etc. So in about 110 acres of farmland, they are now growing, heat-tolerant varieties of tomato, onion, and garlic, and their livelihoods have, are more resilient and improved as a result. My next and final example is from the beautiful island of Jamaica. It's a place called Pleasant Valley, about south of the Jamaica, around, and bit like Bhutan, or maybe even smaller, a very small community of around 1,500 people. Again, agriculture there is the mainstay of people, but then, they're increasingly challenged by climate change impacts in terms of, particularly in terms of availability of water. So with the project that we worked with them, what we did was we rehabilitated, there was a old community water source, and then we rehabilitated the catchment. We helped the community, supported the community in constructing some rainwater harvesting ponds that's, powered by solar. So, it's clean energy, and helps also reduce or limit the greenhouse gas emissions, and worked with the farming group to improve agricultural practices. So this is now helping. This is still a project that is still ongoing, but already with the predictable water supply, it's supporting the lives and livelihood of around 1,500 people, and it has also improved the social capital, the community cohesion, etc., within the village. With this, I sort of come to an end of my presentation. Once again, I want to thank Mark and Tshering for this opportunity to speak to all of you. I'm impressed with what you guys are doing, with climate change being the defining issue of our times. All of us in our individual ways, we need to take action, and what we do as individual citizens of the world, in terms of sustainable consumption, in terms of how we reduce our ecological footprint, definitely will have an impact. So I want to thank everyone, for what you are doing. Thank you for your attention. Maybe we can take some questions. I hope I haven't gone over the time, but yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, you're doing great on time so far. I have a slew of questions. However, I would rather hear from you guys first. So please, anybody jump in there first.
I don't have a question, but I wanted to say thank you for your talk and your presentation. I was unaware of that organization. I think it's amazing, the things that it's doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I hope you will visit the link, learn more about SGP, and we are always looking for young people to work with us. Be it in New York where we are based, headquartered, or in the 125 countries or so. So when you look for opportunities to work overseas, do look for us.
I'm definitely going to look into that personally. My question's kind of a weird one. The appraisal of the success of your program, it looks totally dependent on the value of the dollar. Do you guys do social capital checks to kind of like see the quality of life and happiness, right, improving gradually outside of, because the money thing is a big thing with farming and feeding, but like employability, and we looked a little bit at it with the rural urban migration, trying to mitigate that and keeping like communities alive. And like I can keep going on this, so I'm just keep on the first point. Social capital, where does that figure into your programs?
Jared, thank you very much. I mean, that's a really important issue. I may not have presented it in the examples I showed, but it is indeed a core of our approach. Social capital, both in terms of the community cohesion and and the self-determination for communities to decide for themselves on what they want to do, how they want to protect or manage their resources. But also, what we have noticed in many of our projects is it goes beyond, once they have come together, these communities to work on a natural resource management or an agriculture project or a biodiversity project, it goes beyond that project itself, because now they are able to make decisions for themselves. They're able to sort of even advocate for themselves with their local politicians, if you like, who represent them. So I think we haven't honest answer is we haven't really went around measuring it, but it is an integral part of our approach.
We're getting real close to the end of time, but I wanted to sneak in a question about funding. We're told over and over again in the news how we live in unprecedented times, and you see different organizations, different governments withholding funding from the UN. I was wondering how you feel about the future of this particular program. And also, I was wondering about the ratio of applicants versus funding available.
Thank you, Mark. And I think, again, that's spot on. Really important question. It's an increasing concern in a highly sort of, how do I put it, world where, a lot of these populist sort of governments that cater to one group or, or one way of thinking. There's, a lot of undermining of this multilateralism, and we are all in this together kind of mindset that the United Nations and other multilateral intergovernmental processes are supposed to work on. And of course, that translates to a lot of concern around the resource shortages. This is a real concern. I mean, other than saying, especially I'm looking at the young friends here, go reach out to your, in your constituencies, make sure that, and I think in Canada, I think you probably lucky you don't have to do as much, but because the government is so enlightened. But otherwise, I think each of us, can make sure that our government, and our elected people are paying attention to what is important. I don't know if Mark, you want to throw in anything on that, but yeah.
I think we should make some time now for Brittany here, and I really thank you for your presentation. You are extremely welcome to hang out here for Brittany's presentation as well. Yeah, again, thanks for your time. It's a pleasure to have you in.
So Mark, before we start Brittany, I would like to personally thank my friend Doley for giving us this presentation, and thank you so much personally giving this lecture. So I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, my friend. Thank you for the opportunity as well. I'll stay on for about 10-15 minutes, and then I need to go to another meeting. But look forward to hearing Brittany's presentation as well. And thank you, Mark, and thank you, everyone. I may phase out in about 10-15 minutes, so thank you, and I'll say bye here, and not come in the middle of Brittany's presentation to disturb everyone.
Well, thanks again. And Brittany, floor is yours now.
All right.
I've already done a brief introduction previous, but if you wanted to get a little bit further, I think you probably know more about yourself than I do. So you can start with that perhaps, and then jump into your presentation.
Sure, that sounds good. I'm gonna try sharing my screen. I haven't done this with Google before, so bear with me if it doesn't work. Or if it takes a second. Let's see. Just 1 second. Okay. Yeah, okay. And then how do I? Sorry, just 1 second. It doesn't seem to want to. Does open system preferences? Sorry about this.
Oh, quite all right.
I have to give Zoom permission to look at my computer. Okay, later. Okay, great. That should work. Okay. Can you see that now? Okay. The screen?
Is good.
Okay, perfect. All right, so where we go. My name is Brittany Maguire. I am not an expert in this discussion or conversation at all, but I used to work for the Atlantic Canadian Organic Regional Network as a project coordinator. And at the time, a number of farmers had come to us asking questions about climate change and wanting more information, and we really didn't have any resources to give them, or even places to direct them to find more information. And so I decided to do a little bit of research into it. We got some funding for a limited project of a year. And at that time, we had a conference, a regional conference, where we had a number of talks from experts. We also did a few workshops that I led, where I gave a similar talk, although shorter than I'm going to give you today, kind of introducing what we think is going to happen in terms of climate change and agriculture in the Maritimes, specifically in New Brunswick. I have information for. And then had a discussion facilitated amongst farmers about what that might mean for them. And so that's why I'm here giving this talk to you today. Mark came to one of those talks that I did, the very last one. And so, yeah, I no longer work for Acorn. As you probably all know, that it's not that active anymore, but I work for an organization in Toronto called Meal Exchange, and we're focused on food issues on post-secondary campuses, food security, food sustainability, that kind of thing. I also have my email here if you have any questions, or if I can help you find more information afterwards in any way. So there we go. So what I'm going to talk about first is just what we can expect as the climate changes, and then a little bit about what are the implications for farms, And then how do we look at farm resilience and adaptation planning? I'm just going to go over kind of a high level overview of the variety of tools that are available, but I've got lots of links that I've linked throughout, as well as at the end, I have a slide of where to find more information. So you can look at all those afterwards or get in touch if you need help finding other things. So the first section here is what to expect as the climate changes. We're going to go a little bit into some climate projections, which can be a little bit difficult to follow. So bear with me. I'm going to try to explain as I've learned it, because I have had to learn on my own as well how to read them. So how do we read climate models? I think this is really important to know if you're trying to get a sense, like say you already have a farm or potentially you want to buy a farm and you're trying to figure out what it's going to mean for you, not only in the next 5 to 10 years, but in the long run. I think being able to look at whether it's national or regional government resources around what's expected in your area can help. Although the caveat is that there's a lot of variability in weather, as you probably know, in the Maritimes. And so often it's very difficult to make projections that are accurate for the region. And there is a lack of government, I would say, investment into making that information widely available or even doing the research in the first place. And there's also a lack of weather stations to monitor weather over time in the Maritimes, unfortunately. But I'm going to present to you the information that is available in New Brunswick. It's not available, as far as I know, in Nova Scotia or PEI or Newfoundland. So if you're planning to buy a farm or you have a farm in those areas, I would definitely get in touch with your regional government about it. I don't think enough people are asking for the information. So the important thing to know is this acronym RCP, or Representative Concentration Pathways. They were created by the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to predict various climate futures, all of which are dependent on the greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere, which is dependent on how we behave now and in the future. So those, whether we stop emissions right now or, kind of gradually decline in the next decade or 2 decades, or if we don't decline, all of those put us on a very different path for the future and what we can expect. And so it's important to wrap your head around that when you're looking at climate models, to look at which scenario are they presenting? Are they presenting a low emission scenario, medium emissions, or high emissions? Because that's going to change quite dramatically what the projection is going to look like. Also, the caveat is that even on the global scale, we don't really know exactly what's going to happen. They're all just computer modeling, obviously fed by data, but there's a lot of unknown about various feedback loops that could put us in different situations. So it's all kind of just potential modeling, but it's not exact science of where we're going to see, but definitely there's going to be a lot of variability. So using global climate models, they can create local projections through a process that I do not understand, but it's called downscaling. And that's what we're going to look at here. So in New Brunswick, the government has put together projections for RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5. The first one is a medium emission scenario, and the second one is a high emission scenario. So I just got this from the World Resources Institute in order to kind of give an idea of what RCP 4.5, or a medium emissions pathway, kind of looks like. You can see in the middle there that in 2056, the carbon budget globally is exhausted, and we're going to have a 2.2 degree increase in temperature globally. Like, we're locking that in, and up to 2.9 degrees Celsius. Carbon dioxide emissions peak at 2040, and they still rise above 2010 levels by 2050. So this is like, we're taking action, but not real concerted action as we would in like a low emission scenario. So keep in mind that when we're looking, I'm going to present the projections for this one versus the other one, and you'll see why it's important that we do all we can to lock ourselves into a 4.5 or even lower scenario. And that's would be talking about climate mitigation for that. So the high emission scenario is basically, we don't do a lot to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions as a society, and they continue to rise even through 2100, and we're going to see global temperature increases by up to 4.8 8 degrees Celsius. Also, I'll share just let you know, I'll give this slide to Mark afterwards. So if you want to look at any of the maps and stuff again, you can, because some of them have detailed information on them. So I'm going to go and give medium emissions and high emission scenario for each of the major things that we're going to see happen, or that we're predicting are going to happen. This is already happening, as you've probably experienced. Precipitation is increasing, whether that's rain or snow or freezing rain, and it's occurring and going to continue to occur in more intense events with longer periods of drought in between. So you can see that the maps at the bottom there, you have observations, so 1981 to 2010, that's, you know, our kind of historical baseline. And then Horizon 2020, I think these maps were made a year or two ago, so they were predicting what would happen in 2020, and then the Horizon 2050 is the projection for what might happen in 2050. As you can see, the difference between these maps is that the blue area, which is the high rate of summer precipitation, is increasing in the size of where it impacts the province of New Brunswick, but also in certain regions by the time we get to 2050, like around the north side of the province, you'll see that there's a quite dark blue area, as well as in the south, which would indicate a heavy amount of rain in the summer. You can also online explore fall, spring, and I think winter precipitation as well. So that's the link there that you could access all that information and play around with the different scenarios. It's kind of an old looking website, but the actual information is up to date. So for a high emission scenario, the increase in precipitation is going to happen sooner, so this decade. You can see the dark blue area that we were looking at the northern side of the province. If I go back and then forward, you'll see that increases in 2020, whereas before it was just in 2050. And so, yeah, I think that's important to keep in mind, that we're looking at heavier rainfalls, especially if we're in a higher emission scenario, which, yeah, depends on our action as a society. So this is one of these these pictures is from Hayes Farm, actually. And then one of them is from Ferme Jean Levant in Memramcook. And those are just pictures that I got of farms that were experiencing heavy precipitation, I think in 2018, to show what it might look like for a farm. And obviously that provides a lot of difficulties for growing crops and sometimes even accessing the fields if they're really wet. So another aspect that's related to precipitation is coastal flooding and inland flooding as well. So this map you'll see here is for Hillsborough, New Brunswick, because I did a workshop down there. Basically, as we're experiencing increases in sea level rise due to climate change, we're also experiencing higher precipitation rates, increase in extreme and strong storm frequency, and all of these things together contribute to the potential of coastal flooding, as well as inland flooding that we've seen on the St. John Rivershed, even though the Irvings don't want people to think that that's the case. And yeah, anyway, so you can look at both coastal flooding and inland projection flooding. I think it should be available by now. It wasn't in 2018, but I think that the province was looking at making it available to people who want to go and actually get a map of what it might look like for your farm or for your region. So I got this map from a regional service commission. I just went in and told them that I was going to give a workshop and wanted to know what the flood maps look like. So you could do the same. And if you give them your parcel identifier number, they'll actually give you one for your area. You'll see that the red spot, which is indicating flooding, to, I think it's over 2 meters. So that's pretty significant. All of these places would be impacted by flooding, which there's a number of properties in that area, as well as up along the river here. So it also increases the risk of what we call 1 in 100 year floods, which is basically just that there's a 1% chance of an extreme flood or storm every year. But the rate at which those might happen is more likely to happen under more extreme climate emission scenarios. So shifting towards a different aspect of this is a change in the heat that we experience in the summer. So as the climate changes, the growing seasons are expected to increase in length. So you'll see that here on the bottom side, we have 148 days being the kind of lightest color, and then you'll see that the increase to 223 days happens in a few places in the 2050 scenario, and just in general, the 186 days seems to increase in most of the province. So I think it's pretty safe to say that we can expect to experience that. The caveat is that we're also expected to experience some variability, like late frosts, early snows, and that kind of things. So it's not all that it's going to be a lot easier to grow things for longer. There's other complications. In a high emissions scenario, the increase in growing season length is greater in time frame. So you can see in some areas they're projecting up to 261 days by the 2050 horizon, as well as just the geographical extent of the province. So the whole province looks like it's going to be experiencing a greater growing season if we have higher emissions. The next one here is also related to warm weather. So we have growing degree days. Under the medium emission scenario, what we're expected to see is for that to increase through, especially the middle of the province there, and then by 2050 to increase in all of the province, mostly except for some pockets. Growing degree days, as you might know, are a measure of heat accumulation and are expected to increase. So you can see here that the high emission scenario, by 2050, the growing degree days is quite a bit greater in certain regions. So down by Fredericton and Moncton. So again, if we're in a higher emission scenario, it's going to increase that impact. So hot days that are over 25 degrees Celsius are expected to increase. Of course, that can have implications on whatever you're growing, depending on what it is, as well as on livestock and also on people that are working in the fields. So the average number of days that are hot over 25 degrees are expected to increase. You can, even in a medium emission scenario, by 2050, you can see that there's going to be over 106 days in Fredericton, Moncton area, and everywhere in between. That will be over 25 degrees. So that's quite a bit. Yeah, and then you can also explore on the website the amount of days that are over 30 degrees or 35 degrees Celsius. There's not as big of an impact with that, although under the high emission scenario, there is a bit of increase in that, but you can play around with on the website. So again, here under medium emissions, oh, this is supposed to be a high emission scenario, sorry about that. So you can see that it increases depending on if we have high emissions. So what does this all mean for farms? There's a lot of information there, and there's also a lot more than you could actually explore on the website that I linked. Basically, we're going to have longer growing seasons regardless of the emission scenarios and more growing degree days. And this may increase farm productivity, although there's a lot of caveats to that. So there's going to be greater variability, more unpredictability, and definitely more extreme weather events, especially under a high emission scenario. And some examples of these are late frosts. This happened, I think it was in 2018 when I was working for Acorn. There were a lot of fruit growers in Nova Scotia that were our members that were hit by a late frost, and some lost quite a bit of crops, I think even up to like 80% for some, especially if you don't diversify what you're growing. You can be hit pretty bad by things like late frosts or let's say early frosts or snow. Sweet Soil Organic Farm near Sackville experienced an early snow, I think maybe in 2018 or 2019, and that destroyed some of their crops. There's also going to be, like I said before, longer periods of drought marked on either end by heavier rainfall. So that's really hard to plan for. And then there's more hot and very hot days, which has implications for the crops you're growing, your livestock, as well as people, whether it's yourselves or if you employ any farm workers. It can be very difficult to work under such hot conditions. And then heavy rainfalls at some point. So it's hard to predict how to plan your work. Yeah, and then, so we can also expect stronger storms and winds. This has had some impact on farms, especially with infrastructure. So I think it was in 2018 that a number of greenhouses, especially around the Sackville area, had blown down because of really strong winds that they hadn't experienced before. So farms are having to think about how to make infrastructure stronger than they would have had to before. Also, we have coastal and inland flooding. That doesn't impact all farms, but if you are looking at property or have property near a major watershed or near the coast, I would definitely look into it to see what they're predicting for your area. Or if you're going to buy a farm, you want to know, is that a possibility? Also, with the changes in weather and also warmer winters, we're expecting to see changes in weed, pest, and crop diseases. And there's not a lot of research, at least when I last looked into it in about a year ago, there wasn't a lot of research being done, at least not that was, I would say, publicly available or in any way that's could be communicated easily to farmer groups or other folks that are trying to understand the situation. So that's definitely something I would say, if you're part of a farmer organization or have a possibility of talking to your government, to ask for more information on all of these things, including changes in weed and pest pressures going forward, so that you can actually plan. Sorry, it's pretty hot here today. So farm resilience is really important. So what I mean by that is the ability to withstand, respond, and adapt to changes. And you might have already talked about this in your education at Hayes Farm, but it's really being ready to deal with any of the challenges and variability that might happen as climate change unfolds. And so a really important part of this is soil health, as you probably know. So increasing soil organic matter can improve your soil health and your farm's ability to withstand both wet and dry conditions. To improve soil structure, some farms are experimenting with decreasing the amount that they till the land, which the previous speaker was talking about, and you probably have talked about at Hayes Farm anyways, but I think it's important to reiterate. And also covering the soil with cover crops to protect the soil from erosion, add back nutrients that are lost from the soil, which could happen in really heavy rain situations or storms, and to improve soil structure in general. So another important piece of this that I'm not really talking about much, but increasing soil organic matter can also increase the amount of carbons that's stored in the soil. And ultimately, this contributes to climate mitigation. I also think that the more that, let's say, large scale and conventional farmers see that small or organic farmers are using practices to protect their soil health, and it's working not only to increase their productivity, but to increase their ability to withstand these great changes that are happening, the more likely that those big farms are going to adapt as well. And the more likely that we're going to see on a big scale, like mitigation happening and decrease in greenhouse gas emissions, or at least carbon storage in the soil on a larger level in agriculture. I think that I think that's really important to think about, and to share those learning practices with people who might not be the first type to think about it, to really build those bridges between the different types of farms in the province and in the country. Just because we're going to need to share stories and experience in order to figure out how to go forward and to be more resilient. So, sorry. Another thing to prevent erosion prevention is the creation of shelter belts and, again, cover crops. I've linked here something called BC Farm Practices and Climate Adaptation. I've linked it on a number of sites coming. I think they are really great information sources that talk about each of these practices in kind of a general way, and then give case studies of other farms. They're all in BC, but how they've actually implemented these practices, how much they cost, whether they were effective or not. So even though it's from a different area, I think they're pretty cool resource to check out. Another important part, I think, of farm resilience is diversifying your crops so that not only for the health of your soil, but also if anything does happen, like say you have fruit trees and you have a late frost and you lose quite a number of your yield, then you don't want to be financially destroyed for the rest of the season or going forward, because then you won't be able to be resilient and adapting to all the different situations that might come under climate change. So I think that's really important. And then another aspect to think about is potentially locally adapted seed. So you could look at this link that I've provided, but Acorn still runs a seed program, which includes a seed bank that farms can actually give to and then get farm seeds from, as well as Steph Hughes, who runs that program, runs a variety of field tours and farm days that can show you how to save seeds and talk about adaptation. So I think that's a really neat thing to think about. Of course, if the theory is that if the seeds are saved and grown and saved, in the regions that are experiencing climate change adaptations, they might have the ability to actually thrive better in those conditions. So I think protecting and growing seeds is really important. Another important thing to think about is water management. If we're talking about really heavy rainfalls that come and then drought in between, I think thinking about water is probably one of the most important things going forward. So you can improve your drainage on the farm. Again, I've linked BC Farm Practices and Climate Adaptation Guide there, and they go through this in much more detail. And there's lots of other resources as well out there. So you can deal with your surface drainage by creating ditches and landforming to redirect surface water to ponds. You'll see these pictures are from Ferme Chalivant in Memram Cook. Guy sent these pictures to me a few years ago. What they had done is create ditches and ponds. And they also were doing their best to minimize soil compaction. That's Sweet Soil Organic Farm was also trying to minimize the soil compaction to deal with a heavy amount of rain when we were doing this project. You can also work on your subsurface drainage by using drainage tiles, which this farm had done, and also using a network of drain pipes. I don't know how that works, but there's information in the BC Farm Practices and Climate Adaptation Guide there, so you can click on that after. Also, you need to be able to manage your water for drought. It's kind of difficult because you have to do both in any given season potentially. So a really important thing to think about is efficient irrigation. So farms that actually might have never had to have irrigation before will probably have to think about it going forward if they're not already thinking about it, and making sure that it's efficient so that you're using the minimum amount of water to do what you need to do in case that there are drought conditions. You could also think about water collection and storage on farms. So something like a pond and ditches to redirect water to ponds or land formation is not only great for dealing with when you have too much water, but it also allows you to save water for when you need it. So that's a really great thing to think about. You can also use rainwater collection tanks. This picture is from Estelle from Understory Farm and Design. They had been using a rainwater collection tank, and I think solar energy was used to pump the water through the irrigation. So that's kind of neat. And that's near Sackville, New Brunswick. Again, I've linked the BC Farm Practices and Climate Adaptation Guide, so you can read through a little bit more examples of what other people are doing. A thing to think about if you're thinking about creating a pond is that I would reach out to the Department of Agriculture, wherever you are, and get a recommendation for how to do it, or if there's any engineers that you need to talk to, because you don't want to do it, you want to do it right. There's also some soil organizations in the province, and they might be able to give you some more information as well. this is the last slide that I have about adaptation planning. So I think a really important thing is to learn from other farmers. So share experiences, you know, both in terms of like what you're experiencing in terms of climate change, but also, sorry, it's very loud in Toronto. Both in terms of sharing your experiences with what you're experiencing in terms of climate changes, but also what you're doing to deal with it, whether that's through farm tours or conferences, kitchen table meetings, or just talking to farmer organizations that you actually want to know more about this and have the opportunity to talk about it. The only reason why we started a project at Acorn and were able to get government funding to do something about it was because we had a number of farmers come forward. So I think that if it's something that you want more information about, definitely tell people that you want more information, and then it's more likely to happen. The other thing is financial planning for risk. So potentially, you know, you might experience changes in crops, whether you have crop loss or you want to plant new things. So I think talking with your customers, if you have CSAs, to tell them what you're experiencing will make them more understanding and more likely to stay in your program even if there's changes. Another important thing to look into that I don't know much about is insurance for crops and infrastructure. I think that it's pretty difficult for small scale diversified farms, but potentially the more people who advocate for it and ask for it, that might change. So that's something to think about. Also, as I said before, there's more high winds and strong storms that are probably headed our way. So thinking about season extension infrastructure and how to make it stronger and protect it from that is really important, because you could lose a lot of money overnight if not. Another last thing that I'll say is that I think it's really important to advocate and apply for government action and support. So I've linked here New Brunswick's environmentally sustainable agriculture program. They actually have funding that you can apply to as a farm to do a variety of different climate adaptation methods. So if that's something that you're thinking about, I would definitely submit an application. They also have funding for agricultural groups and producer organizations to submit to create learning opportunities for our farms about environmentally sustainable agriculture and climate adaptation. So that's something to think about. I also think broadly, not enough government support is being talked about or asked for or given to farmers to deal with this. It's a pretty intense situation that is happening and that is coming our way. And I think that without you know, financial support and are able to take risks and try projects, it's going to be very difficult. Or if governments aren't willing to spend the money to not only do research about climate change, which I know that they're doing, but actually employ someone to communicate about it. So there's a number of research farms, even in the Maritimes, that they're doing cool things, but they're just not talking about it. And I was pretty disappointed by how hard it was for me as an employee of a farmer organization to find the information that I needed in order to give farmers the tools that they need, and they weren't being responded to by the government either. So there are, outside of work and other things that I'm involved with, I've been involved with a movement for a Green New Deal in Canada. And unfortunately, I've noticed that food and farming is really left out of those conversations. And I think that that's too bad, because I think that it should be a fundamental thing as we're thinking through long-term food security and long-term social justice in our country and in climate change. I think we can't leave the conversation about food and farming behind, and then include support for farmers to both mitigate and adapt to climate change. So I'll leave it there for that. So here's a variety of lists of, a variety of information that you can get. So again, I've linked the BC Agriculture and Food Climate Action Initiative they have lots of information on there. The Climate Atlas is kind of cool. They have a one page about agriculture with some videos and stuff that you can look at. They also have projection maps. So if you're not based in New Brunswick, if you're in Nova Scotia or PI or anywhere else, you can move the map around to look at other provinces. It's not as detailed as the ones that I've shown today, but it's kind of fun to play around with, and you can click low and high emission scenarios. Farmers for Climate Solutions is a new movement that's coming out for farmers talking about climate mitigation adaptation. You can click through that website. It's pretty new, so there's not that much content, but it's interesting. Rural Roots to Climate Solutions is a podcast and organization from Western Canada, and they have lots of cool information on their website. So I would definitely check that out. And you can put it in your ears while you're doing stuff on the farm. New England Adaptation Survey is run by Alyssa White, who's pictured here. She did a workshop for us at the Acorn Conference in PEI, I think in 2018, anyways, I can't remember, but she is doing her PhD in climate adaptation for small farmers in New England, and a lot of the predictions are quite similar to the Maritimes. So she's got some interesting stuff on there and some research she's doing about what farmers are doing to adapt in that area. So that's pretty cool. Again, if you want any maps of flooding or anything else for land predictions for New Brunswick, I would definitely get in touch with your Regional Service Commission. It seems to me that some are better funded than others for some reason, but I would reach out to them. And some of them, like the one in Sackville, you could just walk into the office and he was able to give me maps for a variety of areas. That's neat. There's also local climate NGOs, so like EOS or ACAP St. John or the Ecology Action Center in Nova Scotia. All of them run climate workshops, and some about flooding specifically. So if they have those, or if you want that information, I would reach out to them to talk about it more, because they would be the experts on that, and also the experts on how to prevent coastal and inland flooding. They do a lot of different projects, and sometimes can give you funding to do that. So that's a cool thing to look into. Also, obviously, farmer organizations. I put the National Farmers in here, but there's lots of other organizations that you could look into, both for advocacy and for more information. Sorry, I've talked a lot, so that's what I have to say, but I'd like to answer any questions if you have them. I can't see people, just so you know. I don't know if I'm just using this wrong. Oh no, there we go, I found it.
I just want to say thank you. This presentation was super interesting. And Matthew, who's also on this call too, we're both in the same program at UNB, and it's environmental management, and he just graduated. But like everything in this presentation was super relevant to our degree, and it was like a really interesting take on it, because we always learn about climate change and how it'll affect forestry. So it was really interesting to hear about climate change in agriculture. So yeah, and like you were talking about like the like coastal flooding maps and stuff, and we had a class where like we did projections for it and stuff like that. And it's just crazy to see how much of New Brunswick will be underwater in a few years if we continue like our current ways. So yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty scary, and it's also kind of scary that they're not. I feel like it's not being well communicated. I mean, I only lived in New Brunswick and worked for Acorn for 2 years, but during that time, it was hard to get the right information, and that's actually a lot easier in New Brunswick than any other province in the Maritimes to get, or than to Canada to get the information, which is even more disappointing. So I don't know how they're expecting people to be able to plan their lives and plan not only just for the you know, their own farm success, but regional food security if they don't know what's happening in their region. Yeah, but anyways, thanks for your comment.
No problem. Also, there's one other thing that it reminded me of when we were talking about like how climate change would affect agriculture. We took a hydrometeorology class, and basically we did like projections and modeling, and we found out like in the next 50 years, balsam fir will completely phased out of New Brunswick because it can't handle the heat that'll be coming with climate change. And like maples will be doing really well because they can handle like the heat and the precipitation that we'll be getting. So yeah.
Wow, I didn't know that. There's the Friends EOS and the Friends of Fundy Park, I think. I'm forgetting exactly. They put out like a pamphlet a few years ago that had a list of the different trees that you could plant on your property that would be able to withstand the future climate conditions that we're looking at. So if that's something that you're interested, I would contact either of those organizations to find out more.
I wanted to say thanks for some super hyper local information. That's super great. Over my experiences in 20 years on farming, wind has certainly become more of an issue every single year, and vast, like big rain events and then droughts in between. But the question I want to ask you though is here, I don't want to out anybody here, but in New Brunswick, as I talk to other farmers, there are some farmers that don't want to talk about this at all. What's with that? Any insights?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a few things going on there. Obviously, like I'm not a psychologist, so I don't really know, but I think that there's a bit of, I think they call it cognitive dissonance. Like, you know, the people are scared of it, or they don't want to deal with it, so they don't want to talk about it, you know, and it's easier to pretend that it's not happening. I think I think we're seeing that in, you know, I'm in Ontario right now, where we have a pandemic that's really happening in Toronto. And some people are going to like get drunk with their friends in the park and have party with 10,000 people. You know, if that's not pretending it's not happening, I don't know what is, right? Like, so I think that it's similar. And we're talking about something that could if you get it, you're probably going to get sick, you know, and people are still not willing to think even that medium term about their lives. And so sometimes I think that maybe that's a controversial opinion, but anyways, I think that people are scared and anxious maybe, or they know that they would be if they gave it thought, so they just don't wanna. I also think that there's a political aspect to it, you know. I think that believing in climate change and acting on it is generally something of the left, you know, or the progressive side of things. And so I think that some people who are typically conservative are scared to talk about it because they might be ostracized in their communities, or they might be ostracized, or they might challenge their views in other ways, or they don't want to challenge, they really believe in the conservative fiscal views or whatever it is, and it's hard to have a nuanced approach to that, to say like, I'm conservative in some aspects, but I also believe in climate change and I think we should take environmental action. Not all communities are open to that kind of nuance, you know, and it can be really heated. I have some people, shockingly, in my family that don't believe in climate change, and I have 2 environmental degrees and have been a climate activist for about a decade, and we still argue about it. And I have a master's degree in environmental science, and they still don't believe me, you know. And so that's I don't know. Yeah. Anyways, that's my best guess, but. Or they just, you know, don't think that they see it, or, you know, they don't understand the science. Science literacy in this country, unfortunately, is very low. So I think that people are like, oh, but we had a hail we just got hail last week in Toronto. So people are like, oh, there's hail in June. So that means climate change isn't real, you know, because I think it's all global warming and that there's not changes they don't understand that there's changes that come with that. And it doesn't just mean that we're warmer all the time, you know. So that's a long answer, and I'm not sure if it, what is it called? There's an interesting book that I read. It's a bit old now, but it's short. It was something called Cultivating Utopia. I don't know if you've heard about it, but it was written in Nova Scotia by an academic, I think, at Dalhousie, but it's about their experience doing research on organic farms in Nova Scotia, and they were living on a variety of farms and talking to conventional and organic farms, and they were kind of describing the difficulty of being an organic farmer in a conventional community in Nova Scotia, and the political and social isolation some people feel. So I think that that's related to that, you know. I did a year abroad when I was younger in Ecuador, and we visited some farms in the Andes, and they were feeling the climate effects, and this was like 2012, I think. And we visited one farm that was taking things seriously and, you know, improving soil health, reducing their use of pesticides, and all these various things. And they no longer had any friends. The community had ostracized them, you know, and I think that might happen in the Maritimes too. So it's complicated.
Very complicated. I felt a little bit of that myself when I started an organic farm in rural Ontario in 2001. I felt a little bit of that ostracization, but it melted quickly, I'm happy to say. And I hope people see their way through this issue too. Because like, how could farmers keep ignoring it? Especially like young farmers. I can understand some of the older farmers wanting to ignore it, but like the ones that are getting into the game, it's just, how can you choose to ignore it? It just blows my mind.
I also think that there's like sometimes if someone doesn't believe in climate change some people are quite rude to them, you know, or they don't know, or they don't really know, or whatever. You know, some people on our side can get defensive, and then that makes the other person defensive. I think that the important thing, like I kind of mentioned earlier, is to create opportunities for, you know, organic or small scale or whatever ecological farms and conventional farmers to talk to each other, and try to be open and have dialogue and get to know each other in a more holistic way, and try to listen to why they don't believe it, and give a rational response that's not too like angry, you know. Then I think that we might see that people change. I also think that if they see that people are, whether or not they believe in climate change, if they see that other farms are succeeding and doing better than they are, by using some of these practices like that protect soil health, then I think that they're more likely to jump on the bandwagon regardless of whether they believe in climate change or not. And I think when we had our regional conference in PEI a few years ago, Joel Salatin was the keynote speaker, and he was talking about this, you know, like big farmer in, I think he's in the south of the United States, where like not that many people believe these kinds of things, or even believe in you know, protecting soil health instead of running it to the ground and then starting again, you know. And so, but people had been starting to feel the effects in their soil of you know, long-term not really caring for it, and he had changed his practices, and a variety of other big, I think there's a few other farmers that I'm forgetting the name in the United States that are kind of well known now that have done those things, and just by doing it in a large scale, they're showing that it's possible and that you can actually increase your yields. So even if we can convince everyone to do that, and they don't even need to believe in climate change if they just act the way we want them to act, you know. Yeah, that's a long answer, but it's an interesting question.
Does anybody else have anything to add to the conversation here?
Is anyone thinking, like, I don't know if any of you have farms or you're thinking about buying a farm, or does this change the way that you're going to think about things? I think that's an interesting.
Just like a funny thing, it's not funny, it's like that weird kind of humor. These instructors at the school, going to UMB with Hannah, he's like, if you take anything away, he's like, don't buy beachfront property. Kind of that cynical, you know, is coming.
Yeah, do not buy beachfront property. That's for sure. And look at like if you're going to buy a farm, definitely see if you can contact the Regional Service Commission, or if it's in a different province, I don't know what the other departments would be, but to find the maps so that you're making an informed decision, and not for recent floods, but for their like projected future floods.
Well, looking at your maps there about the precipitation and how much precipitation is supposed to be projected to fall in northern New Brunswick, then makes me think about the floodplains and the rivers. And if you're purchasing farmland along a floodplain that's been traditionally a floodplain, well, that could now just be part of the river into the future. And so, let alone beachfront, the riverfront too. Yeah. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think that again, this is where the government needs to step in and you know, reinforce some of the abattoir, not the abattoir, what do you call them? Abattoir? I can't remember what they're called. But anyways, the dams and different infrastructure to protect flooding. You know, I think that a lot of people are worried about what's going to happen between the connection between the small land connection between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, and there are some farms that use that every day to sell, you know, like that's what they use on the weekends to sell in Sackville, but they live in just on the other side of the border in Nova Scotia. And I think the government is investing in doing projects, but they're not talking about it, you know. And so I had a number of farmers that were very worried because they just didn't know that the government was doing anything about it, you know. So yeah, anyways, it's kind of too bad. I think I'm interested. Do you know if anyone in New Brunswick or Nova Scotia is like doing climate change work with farmers anymore?
I don't.
I would say Louise Como might be a good bet. Like she just does everything climate change related and definitely would have good connections to that.
Yeah. I mean, that's too bad. I really think that like if you end up buying a farm somewhere and are actively farming, or even now, I think it's, if you can join a farmer organization and start talking about it, I think that's really important for resilience going forward for everyone. To be able to share stories and find out that information, and even, like I said before, if there's a regional organization that has the capacity to start a program to deal with this, they're only going to do it if they hear from people that it's of interest. I've heard recently that the National Farmers Union Youth Committee, I don't know what it's called, but they have started talking about what it would mean to join the conversations that are happening nationally with other youth about a Green New Deal. And so like getting involved in advocacy, whether it's that or others, I think is really important, so that your voices are heard. I think we're hearing from a lot of voices that are impacted by climate change, but I don't think farmers are being heard. And I really think that needs to be shared more often, more loudly, if we're going to see any sort of government support or change going forward.
Any other questions there from the class?
Yeah, I'm kind of just wondering whether you think it's more of an issue that like there's not enough research being done, whether through academic institutions or the government, or if it's just that communication of the material that's not being done, like kind of where the breakdown is bigger.
I would say in the communication front. Okay. But there is a climate lab at UPEI, for example, and we had them come and do one talk at a conference a couple of years ago, but that's the only time I really got information about agriculture from them. And on their website, they don't have a lot of information about by the talk. They certainly know what they're talking about. And so that tells me that there are people that know way more than I do that are not talking about it, or I emailed the PEI government had put together an adaptation report for the island and a couple of years ago, and I had only heard about it because somebody passed it to me. Like they didn't bother to contact the regional organic association to tell them about it. And there was a whole chapter on agriculture in there, they said that they were going to do start farmer support networks and all of these beautiful things that I was like, oh my God, that would be great. This is like what we need. And then I emailed them, and I think they took 8 months to respond to me. And basically said they didn't know. And I was like, well, I don't know either, like trying to figure it out, or, or different, some farmers would get in touch with us to ask them just how to apply for funding for these different programs, climate change or otherwise. And the government just wasn't responding to them, but then was mad that they were going to us for help, but there's no one available to help them. It was very weird, There's also like the Organic Institute, or I can't remember what it's called right now, at Dalhousie, at the agricultural campus in Truro. And I know that they know a lot about these things and they're doing research, but they're so busy doing that and they don't have the support for like extension, right? Like, I mean, I don't know that much about these things, but apparently back in the day, there used to be rural extension officers from the government to actually support farmers in whatever they needed, and that's been kind of gutted. So there's not really anyone from the government to support, and then academic institutions are so busy and they don't really have the funding or whatever it is to be going out in the field just communicating back their research. I knew some people that were doing research about climate change and farming, but then weren't talking to farmers about their results. And I don't necessarily think that that's because they don't want to. It's just that they're not given the funding or the time in the deadline to publish and do conferences with other academics. Anyways, it's really complicated, but I think it's important. It's also important shows why it's important for farmers to talk to each other, right? Like, I think that when I started reaching out to the few farmers that are like pictures from on these slides to ask them if they had been thinking about climate change and what they had been doing, a number of them had been doing a lot of things about it, but they just hadn't been telling anyone else, And so when I was having other farmers ask me what to do, it's like, oh, you guys should talk, anyway, so that's a long-winded answer, but I think there's a lot of information out there. And I think that like the projections is basically, they're helpful, but there's just going to be a lot of variability. So what you need to do is improve farm resilience. And there's already a lot of information about soil health that is way beyond me, but that's out there. We just need people to actually show farmers how to do it and how to change their practices if they're older, or how to start with a different way of farming if you're just getting into farming. So yeah. Thank you for that question. I think it's a really important thing to highlight.
Yeah, no problem. I actually worked for the Southwest New Brunswick Regional Service Commission last summer doing a recreation project, and that's just definitely a thing where it's like information's out there, but you're just like searching for it and people aren't talking to each other, and yeah.
Yeah, and I had to I think I emailed them a couple times and I didn't get the information that I needed, and then finally I just went in and I was like, can you please just give me the map? And then within an hour, you just got to bug people, I guess.
All right, well, thanks everybody for hanging in there. We're officially 12 minutes over time here, and thanks Brittany for your presentation today. I'm attempting to wrap things up. If anybody does have any last questions here for Brittany, please throw it out there. Otherwise, thank you very much for your talk here today, Brittany.
Thank you for inviting me to do this. It's kind of interesting. I stopped doing this a year ago, so it's fun to come back and do it again and refresh my memory on all these things.
I'm glad you can get some more mileage out of that presentation as well. All right, I think we're wrapping then. Thank you so much for your time there, Brittany.
Thank you so
and
much.
Thanks everybody for hanging in there. And we'll see you all on farm. Maybe not Brittany so much. We'll see you all on farm tomorrow morning to harvest our spring onions. Yay!
Bye.
Bye, everyone.